There are secrets buried so deep that people convince themselves they are dead. But secrets never die. They only wait. A black Maybach worth $2 million came to a stop at the corner of Skid Row, the most wretched slum in Los Angeles. Inside the car sat Reid Ashford, 33 years old, the Mafia boss who controlled half the city. People called him the Ghost, because no one had ever seen him strike with his own hands. Yet his enemies still vanished without a trace. Tonight, he had come here for one reason only: to inspect a new location for expanding his territory. Nothing more. The car moved slowly through the darkened streets, past nameless faces curled into themselves in the night. Reid didn't look at them. He had seen too many sights like that to care anymore. Then he saw the little girl, 6 years old, standing alone beneath a flickering street lamp. An oversized coat swallowed nearly her whole body. Her sneakers were split open at the toes, and in her tiny hands she held a tray of homemade cookies. But what caught Reid's attention wasn't the miserable state of her clothes. It was the way she stood. Her back was straight. Her chin was lifted, as though this entire world had no right to break her. Reid was about to turn away. He had seen thousands of children like her in his life. They had nothing to do with him. But then the pale yellow light spilled down from the lamppost, and he saw it, on her left wrist. Glinting, a silver bracelet engraved with the image of a wolf. Reid's heart tightened as if an invisible hand had closed around it. He knew that bracelet. He had drawn the design himself, commissioned it himself. There had only ever been one in this world. And 7 years earlier, on a night he had thought he had buried forever, he had taken it off his own wrist and fastened it around the wrist of a woman whose name he had never even had the chance to ask. He stepped out of the car. He didn't give an order to his bodyguards. He didn't need anyone to follow. His footsteps rang across the wet pavement as he walked toward the little girl. She lifted her face and looked at him, and Reid Ashford stopped breathing. Gray eyes, clear as a winter lake, the same color as his, the same steady gaze, fearless and direct, as if he were staring into a mirror from the past. Reid Ashford had stood with a gun aimed straight at his head without blinking. He had walked past the bodies of his enemies without a single change in his heartbeat. He had built an empire out of blood and darkness without ever once letting his hands tremble. But in this moment, standing before a 6-year-old girl selling cookies on a ruined street corner, for the first time in 33 years of life, he felt the ground beneath him collapsing, because he was looking at himself in the eyes of a child whose existence he had never known. If you'd like to know what happens next, please hit like to support us. Share this video with those who love deeply emotional stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. Reid moved closer to the little girl, trying to soften his voice as much as he could. It wasn't something he often did. His voice had been made to command, to threaten, to make others obey. But standing in front of this child, he suddenly felt that he had to weigh every word with care. He asked her what her name was. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his without the slightest trace of fear. Maddie. Just one word, no last name, no further explanation. Her voice was clear and young, yet firm, as though she had already grown used to saying no more than what was necessary. Reid pointed to the silver bracelet on her wrist and asked where she had gotten it. Maddie lowered her gaze to the bracelet, her tiny fingers brushing the finely carved wolf. My mother gave it to me, since I was very little. She said this was the most important thing she had. Reid's heart tightened. He swallowed and asked another question, his voice rougher than he had intended. What about your father? Where is he? Maddie shook her head, and there was no sadness in her eyes, no anger, only simple acceptance. I've never met my father. My mother said he went very far away before I was born. I don't know what he looks like. Reid felt something inside his chest beginning to crack. He looked around the dark street, at the suspicious figures drifting in and out of the alley shadows, at the stench of garbage and sewer water rising thick into the air. This wasn't a place for a 6-year-old child after nightfall. He told Maddie to let him take her home, that it was dark now, and it wasn't safe for a little girl to be here alone. Maddie looked him up and down. Her eyes moved over his expensive suit, his polished leather shoes, the gleaming watch on his wrist. Then she shook her head. Thank you, mister, but that's not necessary. My mother taught me not to trust men who wear expensive clothes, especially men who stop luxury cars in places where they don't belong. My mother said people like that always want something, and what they want is never anything good. Reid went still. He, The Mafia boss who made an entire city tremble had just been flatly rejected and taught a lesson by a 6-year-old child. He didn't know whether he should be angry or laugh, maybe both. Before he could say another word, Maddie bent down and picked up her tray of cookies. She gave him a polite nod, as though they had just finished an ordinary social conversation. "I have to go now. My mother is waiting. You should go home too. It's very dark here." Then she turned and walked into the alley behind her. She didn't hurry. She wasn't afraid. Her small steps were steady, as though the darkness were an old friend she had known for a very long time. Reid stood there watching her, his mind spinning. He signaled to Nash, his most trusted right hand, a man of 38 who had followed him through more than 10 years of war and bloodshed. "Follow her. Don't lose her. Find out where she lives." Nash nodded and moved quickly into the alley. He was one of the best men Reid had. He had never failed a single assignment. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Nash came back empty-handed, his face clouded with confusion. "She disappeared, sir. I followed her to the third corner of the alley, and then I lost her completely. It was like she melted into the dark. I checked every corner, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sound, nothing at all." Reid looked at Nash, then into the black alley ahead. A 6-year-old girl had just outmaneuvered the best man he had. A little girl selling cookies on the street had vanished like a true ghost. He had built an empire with his bare hands. He had defeated the strongest rivals, the most dangerous enemies. He controlled half of Los Angeles through ruthlessness and a mind sharper than anyone else's. But tonight, he had been beaten by a 6-year-old child in an oversized coat and torn sneakers. Reid got back into the car and shut the door. Nash slid into the driver's seat and waited for orders, but Reid said nothing. He only stared through the window into the darkness where the little girl had disappeared. Those eyes kept rising in his mind and refused to leave. And the silver bracelet. The wolf. The thing he had given away 7 years ago on a night he had believed he had forgotten. Nash asked if he wanted to go home. Reid shook his head. "Find everything on that little girl. Her name is Maddie, around 6 years old, living somewhere near this area with her mother. I want to know everything before noon tomorrow." Nash nodded and pulled the car away from the curb. Reid leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. But he knew he wouldn't sleep tonight, because there was something in that little girl's eyes, something so familiar it hurt, and he would come back. No matter how many times she disappeared, he would find her. Because Reid Ashford never gives up. Especially not when he is looking at himself in the eyes of a child. The Maybach glided through the silent streets of Los Angeles at midnight, carrying Reid back to his mansion in Beverly Hills. The iron gates opened automatically, revealing the stone-paved drive that led into the vast estate he had built with blood and ambition. Everything here was flawless, from the meticulously trimmed lawns to the marble statues imported from Italy. But tonight, none of it meant anything to Reid. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor. Upstairs, the master bedroom was still lit with a muted glow. Paige was in there, his fiancée, a beautiful woman with golden hair and blue eyes as cold as ice. Their coming marriage was a strategic alliance between two powerful families, an arrangement set in motion years ago by her father and the empire Reid had inherited and expanded. Paige had everything a woman could dream of: beauty, money, status. But Reid had never once stopped to ask himself whether he truly loved her. Tonight, he didn't go upstairs. He turned instead into his private study, closed the door, and sat down in the leather chair behind the walnut desk. The room was steeped in darkness, lit only by the distant shimmer of city lights pouring through the great wall of glass. Los Angeles stretched beneath him like a carpet scattered with tiny diamonds. Half this city belonged to him. But tonight, all that power couldn't drive away the image that kept repeating itself in his mind. Gray eyes, clear and unguarded, looking straight at him without the slightest fear, the silver bracelet gleaming on that small wrist. The finely engraved wolf. Reid closed his eyes, trying to force away the storm of thoughts circling in his head. But it was useless. The little girl kept returning to him, along with those sharp words that didn't belong in the mouth of a 6-year-old child. "My mother taught me not to trust men who wear expensive clothes." He opened his eyes, reached for his phone, and called Nash. 20 minutes later, his right hand appeared at the door to the study, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, clearly not having slept either. Reid didn't waste time. "I need everything on that little girl before sunrise. Use every resource we have. I want to know who she is, where she lives, what kind of woman her mother is, and most of all, I want to know where that bracelet came from." Nash nodded and disappeared back into the night. Reid remained alone, staring out over the city, slowly sinking into sleep, while he himself couldn't close his eyes. The next hours passed in silence. He didn't leave the chair, didn't eat, didn't drink, only sat there and waited. When the first rays of dawn began to blush the Los Angeles horizon, Nash returned. In his hand was a thin case file. He placed it on the desk in front of Reid and stepped back. Reid opened it. Inside were a few pages and one small photograph. The picture showed the little girl at school, her eyes staring straight into the camera, not smiling, but not sad either. Madison Mercer, 6 years old, born on March 12th, first grade student at Jefferson Public Elementary School, lives with her mother in a low-cost apartment complex on the edge of the city. After school, she often sells homemade cookies on the street corner to help support the household. Reid turned to the next page. Mother, Jolene Mercer, 27 years old, currently working 3 jobs at once: bartender on the night shift, office cleaner in the early morning, and delivery driver on weekends. Medical records show that she is suffering from a serious lung condition, suspected to be chronic pneumonia, but she doesn't have the money for proper treatment. Reid stopped at the final line on the page. His fingers went still against the paper. The father's information on the birth certificate had been left blank. No name, no details, nothing at all. He began calculating in his head. 6 years old, born in March, 7 years ago, summer, Las Vegas. One night he had thought he had buried in the past, a woman whose name he had never had the chance to ask. The silver wolf bracelet he had removed from his own wrist and fastened around hers before walking away. Could this be? Nash stood in silence, waiting. At last, he asked Reid what he wanted to do next. Reid rose and walked to the wall of glass. Dawn was rising over Los Angeles, washing the entire city in fierce shades of gold and amber. A new day was beginning, and perhaps a new chapter in his life as well. Get the car ready. I'm going back to that street corner. Nash asked whether he wanted men with him. Reid shook his head. No. This time, I'm going alone. And this time, he wasn't going to let the little girl disappear again. That afternoon, as the sun began to lean toward the west, and the last light of day washed the streets of Los Angeles in gold, Reid Ashford returned to the corner in Skid Row. But this time, he didn't come in the glossy black Maybach. He chose a more ordinary car, one that wouldn't draw too much attention, parked it some distance away, then walked the rest of the way. And more importantly, he wasn't wearing his usual expensive 3-piece suit. Just a simple black shirt, dark trousers, no Rolex, no gold cuff links. He had spent the entire morning standing in front of the mirror, trying on one outfit after another like a teenage boy getting ready for his first date. It was ridiculous when he thought about it. A powerful Mafia boss worrying over how to dress in a way that would seem less frightening to a 6-year-old girl. But Reid didn't care. He only knew that he needed to see that little girl again, needed to find answers to the questions burning through his mind. He carried a large paper bag with him. Inside were the things he had sent people out to buy since early morning: a set of fairy tale books with beautiful illustrations, a new pair of pink sneakers in exactly the right size for a 6-year-old girl, a large brown teddy bear with button eyes, and a box of premium cookies from the most famous bakery in the city, the kind where each piece cost as much as Maddie might earn in an entire day of selling. When Reid turned onto the familiar corner, he saw her at once. Maddie was standing in the exact same spot, beneath the street lamp, the tray of cookies in her hands. The oversized coat still hung around her small frame. The torn shoes still covered her little feet, as though time hadn't moved at all since the night before. Maddie recognized him the moment he came closer. Her eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in caution. She didn't say a word. She only stood there watching him with a gaze far too old for a child her age. Reid stopped a few steps away and slowly set the bag down on the ground right in front of her. He tried to smile in a friendly way, something he did so rarely that the muscles in his face felt almost stiff. He said the gifts were for her, that he thought she might like these things. Maddie looked down at the bag, then back up at him. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she asked him directly, her clear voice sharp as a knife. "What do you want from me?" Reid opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He, a man who had negotiated with the most dangerous bosses, persuaded the most stubborn politicians, and threatened the most ruthless enemies, suddenly found himself standing speechless before the simple question of a 6-year-old girl, because the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know what he wanted. He only knew that he needed to be here, needed to see her, needed to learn the truth about the bracelet and about the 7 years that had passed. Maddie waited for an answer for a moment. When she saw Reid remain silent, she let out a sigh, a sound so oddly mature that it felt almost unreal. Then she spoke in a calm voice, as if she were explaining an obvious rule to someone a little slow to understand. "I'll offer you a deal. Listen carefully, because I'll only say this once." Reid nodded, suddenly aware that he was listening with the full seriousness of a man sitting in $1 million negotiation. Maddie held up one finger. "First, you mustn't lie to me. Not even once. Not even a small lie. If you lie, I'll know, and I'll never speak to you again." She raised a second finger. "Second, if you keep your word and don't lie, I'll take you to meet my mother. You can ask my mother anything you want." She lowered her hand and looked straight into Reid's eyes. "But you have to remember, my mother is sick and very tired. If you make her sad or make her cry, I won't forgive you. That's the deal. Do you agree or not?" Reid stood there, looking at the 6-year-old girl laying out terms to him like an equal business partner. No fear, no weakness. She knew exactly what she wanted, and was perfectly willing to negotiate to get it. A strange feeling rose in Reid's chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't irritation. It was something else. Something dangerously close to pride. This little girl had more nerve than most grown men he had ever met. He nodded and said that he agreed to the deal, that he wouldn't lie to her. Maddie studied him for a long moment, as though trying to read whether he was telling the truth. Then she bent down, picked up the bag of gifts, and without opening it, slung it over her shoulder as though it were simply part of the agreement she had chosen to accept. "Follow me. Don't get lost." She turned her back and started walking. Reid followed quietly behind her. They moved through dark, twisting alleys, up cracked concrete steps furred with moss, through narrow hallways that smelled of dampness and sewage. Maddie walked ahead, her small steps steady and certain, without the slightest hesitation. She knew every corner of this dark maze as well as the palm of her own hand. Reid walked behind her, the most powerful Mafia boss in Los Angeles, the man who controlled half the city with an iron fist. But at this moment, he was only a man walking behind a 6-year-old girl in an oversized coat. For the first time in his life, he was letting someone else lead the way. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. And strangely enough, that didn't trouble him at all. After nearly 10 minutes of walking through dark alleys and winding stairways, Maddie stopped in front of an old apartment building. The outer walls were stained with yellow blotches and mold, and many of the windows were covered with sheets of cardboard instead of curtains. The rusted iron fire escape looked as though it could collapse at any moment. This was the kind of place Reid would normally never set foot in, unless he had come to collect protection money or deal with an enemy. But tonight, he had come here because of a 6-year-old girl with gray eyes and a silver bracelet. They climbed 4 flights of stairs, stepping over cracked concrete steps and walls covered in graffiti. The air carried a faint smell of mildew and urine. A few of the hallway light bulbs had burned out, leaving stretches of heavy darkness broken only by patches of weak light. Maddie walked ahead, her steps familiar and steady, without the slightest hesitation, as though she had traveled this path 1,000 times before. At last, they stopped in front of a worn wooden door at the end of the 4th-floor hallway. Maddie knocked in a rhythm of her own, 2 quick knocks followed by 3 slow ones, like a code that only mother and daughter understood. "Mom, I'm home." There were soft footsteps from inside, then the sound of locks being undone. The door opened a crack, and Reid saw her. Jolene Mercer, the woman from the file Nash had given him that morning, 27 years old, yet she looked as though she had lived far beyond that. Thin, pale, with faint lines already beginning to show at the corners of her eyes, the mark of sleepless nights and years of hard labor. But even worn down by life the way she was, she still held on to a fragile kind of beauty that was difficult to name. Her chestnut brown hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her dark brown eyes carried exhaustion, but still shone with quiet resolve. For one brief moment, Jolene's gaze moved past Maddie and came to rest on Reid. Then all the color seemed to drain from her face. Jolene stood frozen. Her brown eyes widened, not with fear, but with something deeper, something stronger, as though she had just seen a ghost step out of the past and into memory. Her hand tightened around the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. Reid noticed the sudden shift in the woman's expression. He felt something familiar stir in him too as he looked at her, like an old melody he had heard somewhere once but couldn't quite place. The curve of her face, the slight lift at the corners of her mouth, the direct gaze that refused to lower itself even while she stood before a man who so clearly belonged to an entirely different world. All of it awakened a vague sense of déjà vu that he couldn't quite catch hold of. The silence stretched for several seconds, heavy enough to feel in the air. Maddie was the one who broke it. She took her mother's hand and said this was Mr. Reid, the man she had told her about the night before, the one in expensive clothes who had come to buy her cookies. Jolene blinked, as though waking from a trance. She looked down at her daughter, then back at Reid, and when she spoke, her voice was cold as ice, without a trace of warmth. "I'm Jolene, Maddie's mother. What do you need here?" There was no polite greeting, no invitation, just a blunt question, a wall of defense thrown up at once. Reid found her hostility strange. She looked at him as though he were an enemy, as though he had done something unforgivable, but he had never met her before. He was sure of that, or at least, he thought he was sure. Maddie tugged on her mother's hand and said she had invited Mr. Reid to visit, that he had bought all of her cookies, and even brought gifts. She lifted the bag of presents like evidence. Jolene looked at the bag, then at Reid with an expression he couldn't read. At last, she stepped aside, a reluctant gesture that allowed him to enter. Reid crossed the threshold and looked around the small apartment. The space was cramped, with only one bedroom, a tiny living room that doubled as a kitchen, and one bathroom. The furniture was old but neatly arranged, and the floor was clean even though it had been worn down by years of use. A few drawings, probably ones Maddie had made at school, hung on the wall. Poor, but with dignity. That was the phrase that came to Reid's mind as he took in the apartment. Jolene stood with her arms folded across her chest and didn't ask him to sit down. She asked him directly, her voice still cold, what he really wanted here, because she didn't believe a man like him would come to this neighborhood just to buy cookies from a child. Reid decided to go straight to the heart of it. He asked about the silver bracelet on Maddie's wrist, asked where it had come from. Jolene didn't blink. Her face didn't change at all when she answered that she had found it at a second-hand market years ago, that it looked beautiful so she had kept it for her daughter. Reid looked straight into her eyes. He knew she was lying. He had interrogated enough people in his life to recognize the moment someone stopped telling the truth, but he didn't press her. Not yet. He only nodded and said that it was a very beautiful bracelet, and a very special one. Jolene looked at him, and for one brief moment, Reid thought he saw a flash of fear in her brown eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by that familiar coldness. This woman was hiding something. Something big, and Reid Ashford, the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles, was going to uncover that truth, no matter how long it took. After Reid left, Jolene stood motionless by the window for a long time, watching the figure of that man fade into the dark. Maddie had fallen asleep long ago, the bag of gifts resting beside her bed, the new teddy bear held tightly in her small arms. The little girl slept peacefully, completely unaware that her mother's world had just been turned upside down. Jolene moved quietly to her daughter's bed, sat on the edge of it, and watched Maddie sleep. In the dim light from the window, she could see the silver bracelet glinting on her child's wrist. The wolf engraved into it with such careful detail still shone as brightly as the day she had received it. 7 years. This bracelet had stayed with her for 7 years, through hardship, through tears, through countless sleepless nights. And now the man who had given it to her had appeared again, standing inside her tiny apartment, looking at her with those familiar gray eyes that hurt to remember, without the slightest idea who she was. Jolene closed her eyes, and the memories came rushing back like waves that couldn't be held back. 7 years earlier. Las Vegas. A blazing summer. She had only been 20, a second-year college student full of dreams and hope. Her group of friends had decided to go to Vegas to celebrate her birthday, a reckless trip she had hesitated over for a long time before finally agreeing. They had gone to one of the most luxurious nightclubs in the city, a place where the price of a single cocktail equaled an entire week of food for her. She hadn't known that the club belonged to the Ashford family, one of the most powerful families in the underworld. She had only known that the music was wonderful and the colored lights were beautiful. She danced on the floor with her friends, laughing with a freedom she had never known before. Then she felt someone watching her. She looked up and saw him, standing on the VIP level, leaning against the railing, one hand holding a glass of liquor, eyes like a storm fixed on her without blinking. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was, yet he carried a kind of power and danger she had never felt in anyone before. She should have been afraid. She should have looked away, but instead, she found that she couldn't. He came downstairs, moving through the crowd as though people automatically parted to make way for him. He stopped in front of her and asked if she wanted a drink, his voice low and warm, yet carrying the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. They talked, they drank, they danced together until the club closed and the music finally died away. She couldn't remember exactly what she had said, only that she had laughed more than she had on any other night in her life, and that he had looked at her as though she were the only person in a room full of people. They went up to the suite on the highest floor of the hotel beside the club. The room was as large as the entire apartment she was renting with her friends, with a view over all of Las Vegas glittering with lights. Before anything happened, he removed the silver bracelet from his own wrist and carefully fastened it around hers. He told her it was something he had kept since childhood, the only thing he had ever truly treasured in a life full of darkness. He told her she was the first person who had made him want to believe there might be something good beyond the world he knew. He said he wanted her to keep it, as a promise that they would see each other again. That night, they belonged to each other, not only in body, but in something deeper, something fiercer, something she had never experienced with anyone else. She had thought it was the beginning of a beautiful love story. She had been wrong. The next morning, she woke alone. The magnificent suite was empty and cold. He was gone. There was no note, no phone number, no name, nothing at all. Only the silver bracelet on her wrist and the trace of his cologne lingering on the pillow. She had waited. She had hoped. She had searched. But how do you find a man with no name in a city of millions? 2 months later, she discovered that she was pregnant. Her family, a conservative Catholic family from a quiet suburb, had cast her out when they learned the truth. Her friends turned their backs on her. She had no choice but to leave college unfinished. She gave birth alone in a cheap public hospital, held her newborn baby alone through the night as the child cried herself hoarse, and fought through each passing day alone to raise her daughter. 7 years, thousands of sleepless nights, tens of thousands of hours of grueling work. And now he was back, arriving in a luxury car, wearing expensive clothes, looking at her as though she were a complete stranger. Jolene opened her eyes and looked down at her sleeping daughter. Maddie had his eyes, his way of tilting his head when thinking, even that same stubborn refusal to bend to the world. The child was a smaller reflection of the man who had abandoned her, and every day she looked at her daughter, she was reminded of him. Now he had returned, knowing nothing of the 7 years of hell she had endured, and Jolene didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Bitterness? Anger? Or fear of what might happen next? In the days that followed, Reid kept returning to that corner in Skid Row, as though some invisible force were drawing him back. Every afternoon, when the sun began to sink toward the west and warm golden light spilled across the ruined street, he appeared again. No more glossy black Maybach. No more team of bodyguards trailing behind him. Just him alone, dressed in simple clothes he had never imagined himself wearing, walking to the street corner where a 6-year-old girl stood selling cookies. At first, Maddie was still wary. She watched him through narrowed gray eyes, weighing every gesture, every word. She asked why he kept coming back every day, whether he didn't have anything better to do. Reid didn't know how to answer. He only said that he liked being there, liked talking with her. Maddie gave a small shrug, looking unconvinced, but she didn't send him away. Then slowly, day by day, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. A week after their first meeting, Maddie started talking more. She told Reid about school, about the teacher who was always scolding her for falling asleep in class because she had to wake early to help her mother, about a boy named Tommy who teased her because of her old clothes, about the stray orange cat she had named Pumpkin and secretly fed every day even though her mother said they couldn't keep a pet because they had no money for animal food. Reid listened, truly listened. Not in the polite, empty way he usually listened in business meetings, but with his whole heart. He sat down on the filthy sidewalk beside her, not caring that dust might cling to his clothes. He asked about Pumpkin, about her lessons at school, about every small thing in her life, and Maddie, like a flower that had been left to wither and was suddenly given water, began little by little to open. One afternoon, when Reid arrived, Maddie was sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk with a notebook and a pencil worn down almost to the end. She was frowning, biting her lip, staring at the page as though it were her sworn enemy. She told him that she hated math, hated it even more than the green vegetables her mother forced her to eat, that she couldn't understand why 2 + 3 made 5, when 2 apples and 3 oranges were clearly not the same thing at all. Reid laughed, the sound escaping before he could stop it. How long had it been since he had laughed like that? He sat down beside her, picked up the notebook, and began to explain. He, the Mafia boss who ran an empire worth billions, sat on a dusty sidewalk, teaching a first grader how to add. He used pebbles he found on the ground as examples, arranging them in small groups so Maddie could see them and count them for herself. When she finally understood and let out a delighted cry, Reid felt a strange joy rising in his chest, the kind of joy that money and power had never once been able to give him. On another afternoon, Maddie wasn't selling cookies the way she usually was. When Reid arrived, she was sitting on the ground with colored pencils in her hand, bent over something she was drawing on a sheet of paper, already softened with wrinkles. She covered the picture when she saw him coming near and said it wasn't finished yet, that he wasn't allowed to look. Reid sat down beside her and waited. They talked about everything and nothing at all. He asked Maddie what she wanted to be when she grew up. She answered without hesitation that she wanted to be a doctor who treated lung disease, so she could cure her mother and her mother wouldn't have to cough through the night anymore. Reid asked why she sold cookies every day, instead of staying home and playing like other children. Maddie looked at him with gray eyes far too old for her age, and answered simply that her mother was sick and needed money for medicine, and that her mother was already working too hard, so she had to help. 6 years old, and she already understood the burden of life. 6 years old, and she already knew what it meant to sacrifice. Reid looked at her, and his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. At the end of that afternoon, when the sunlight had faded and the street lamps were beginning to flicker awake, Maddie handed Reid the finished drawing. It was a simple picture in colored pencil. 2 people standing beside each other, one big and one small, their hands joined together. The taller figure had black hair and gray eyes. The smaller one wore the familiar oversized coat. Underneath, in clumsy pencil letters, written in the uneven hand of a child just learning to write, were the words, Uncle Reid and Maddie. Reid held the drawing in both hands as though it were some priceless treasure. His hands trembled slightly, a reaction he couldn't control. He had received countless expensive gifts in his life, watches worth fortunes, paintings by famous artists, but no gift had ever moved him the way this crooked little drawing did. Maddie looked at him, and suddenly her eyes turned more serious than usual. She asked if he was going to disappear, her voice a little smaller now, carrying a hidden fear. Then she added that her mother said men were always full of promises, but in the end they all disappeared. That her father had disappeared too before she ever had the chance to meet him. Reid looked at her, looked into the gray eyes that were the mirror of his own, looked into the fear of abandonment buried deep inside them, and he told her, his voice firmer than it had ever been about anything, that he wouldn't disappear, that he promised her. Maddie studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether she should believe him. Then she smiled, a small smile but a real one, the first smile she had given him since the day they met. Reid left the street corner that night with the drawing folded carefully inside his shirt pocket, resting close against his chest. He didn't know why he had come to love a child he had known for less than 2 weeks. He didn't know why, every afternoon, he now looked forward to coming to this street corner more than any $1-million business meeting. He only knew one thing. He couldn't walk away, and he wouldn't. The Beverly Hills mansion was flooded with light when Reid stepped through the door. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the soaring ceiling, and the polished marble floor reflected everything like a mirror. This was his world, a world of luxury and power, but tonight, it made him feel more suffocated than ever. Paige was standing in the living room waiting for him, wearing a crimson evening gown that clung to her flawless figure. Her golden hair was swept up, and diamond earrings flashed every time she moved. She looked like a perfect painting, the kind of woman any man would desire. But the look in her eyes when she saw Reid walk in was cold as ice. She said they were 45 minutes late for dinner with the Thornton family, that her father had called 3 times, that this was an important dinner to discuss the wedding, and Reid hadn't even changed clothes yet. Reid glanced down at himself. His black shirt was wrinkled after a long day, and his dark trousers were marked with a few traces of dust from the sidewalk. And if Paige was observant enough, she would notice that the scent clinging to him wasn't the scent of boardrooms or executive offices. It was the smell of the street, of dust, of life in a place that lay only a short drive from Beverly Hills and yet might as well have been 1,000 miles away. He said work had held him up and that he would change immediately. Paige didn't move. She stood there, her blue eyes fixed on him without blinking. Then she spoke, her voice calm in a way that was almost frightening, and asked how much longer he intended to lie to her. Reid stopped in his tracks. Paige went on, saying that she knew he wasn't working every afternoon, that she knew he had been going to the slums of Skid Row, that she knew he had been seeing a child and a woman there. She added that for 3 weeks now, he had gone there every single day, and she wanted to know who that woman was. The air in the room turned thick and heavy. Reid stood still, his face unreadable. He asked who had told her these things. Paige gave a cold little laugh and said, did he really think she was the kind of woman who would sit quietly and wait without keeping watch? That she had people of her own? And they reported everything to her. Reid looked at the woman who would become his wife in a few months. He answered briefly that it was no one important, only a private matter he needed to handle. Paige narrowed her eyes. She asked whether he was really telling her that he had spent 3 weeks handling something that wasn't important. Reid didn't answer. The silence between them stretched on, heavier than any words. At last, Paige turned away and walked toward the staircase. But before she disappeared, she stopped and spoke over her shoulder, her voice cold as steel, saying that she would find out the truth whether he told her or not, and that he should remember who had helped his family gain the position they held today. Then she vanished upstairs, the sharp sound of her heels striking the steps echoing through the silence. Reid stood alone in the enormous living room, staring after her. The look in Paige's eyes before she turned away stayed fixed in his mind. It wasn't the look of a wounded woman. It was the look of someone calculating. Dark, full of schemes. Late that night, after Paige had gone to sleep, Nash came to Reid's study. He handed Reid a stack of files and said there was a serious problem. Reid flipped through the papers while Nash reported. 3 important meetings had been canceled over the past 2 weeks. 2 major partners were beginning to question Reid's absence. And worse, there were rumors that a rival family was using this moment to expand into their territory. Reid closed the file and looked out the window. Outside, Los Angeles shimmered with light, the city he had spent half his life conquering. Nash asked him what he intended to do. Reid was silent for a long time. He knew Nash was right. He knew he was neglecting his empire. He knew everything he had built was beginning to tremble, but every time he thought about stopping, about no longer going back to that corner in Skid Row, he saw Maddie's eyes. He remembered her rare smile, the crooked drawing resting inside the drawer of his desk, the innocent question that carried so much pain. Are you going to disappear? He was standing between 2 worlds. On one side stood the empire of power he had built with blood and tears. On the other stood a 6-year-old girl in an oversized coat with gray eyes, and Reid knew, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, that he was beginning to lean toward one side. The storm hit Los Angeles in the middle of the night without warning. Rain came down in sheets, pouring like a waterfall, while the wind screamed between the high-rise buildings, making a sound as eerie as the howl of a wild pack of wolves. Lightning tore across the black sky, throwing the city into sudden flashes of light before plunging it back into darkness. Reid was sitting alone in his study at the Beverly Hills mansion, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the storm through the great wall of glass. Paige had gone to bed early after a brief but tense argument about his continuing to miss family meetings. He didn't want to face her, didn't want to explain things that even he himself didn't yet understand. His phone vibrated, an unknown number. He was about to ignore it like every other unidentified call, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end turned the blood in his veins to ice. Uncle Reid. Maddie's voice was panicked, trembling, broken by sobs. Uncle Reid, my mom can't breathe. She's lying on the floor, and she won't get up. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. Reid shot to his feet, the whiskey glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor, but he didn't even look at it. He told Maddie to stay calm and tell him where her mother was, whether she was conscious. Maddie said her mother was in the room, coughing so much, with blood, that she was trying to say something, but Maddie couldn't hear clearly. He told the little girl to stay with her mother and not go anywhere, that he was coming right now. Reid stormed out of the room, not taking time to grab a coat, not taking time to call Nash or anyone else. He jumped into the nearest car in the garage and drove straight into the rain. The storm had turned the streets of Los Angeles into rivers, visibility almost gone. But Reid didn't slow down. He drove through the storm at full speed, ignoring red lights, ignoring every rule of the road. There was only one thought in his head. Maddie, Jolene, get there in time. 20 minutes later, he pulled up in front of the old apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The rain was still crashing down as though it meant to drown the world. He ran from the car, sprinted up 4 flights of stairs in seconds, his clothes soaked through, rainwater streaming down his face. The apartment door wasn't locked. He shoved it open and saw a sight that made his heart seize. Jolene was lying on the floor, her thin body shaking, her face so pale it looked drained of every drop of blood. She couldn't stop coughing, each fit tearing through her chest, and there was a smear of dark red blood on her lips. Her breathing came in broken, wheezing gasps, as though her lungs were refusing to work. Maddie was kneeling beside her mother, tears spilling down her cheeks, her tiny hands clinging to her mother's hand as though she would never let go. Reid didn't say a word. He didn't ask permission. He walked over, bent down, and gently lifted Jolene into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, as though illness had eaten away everything in her body until only skin and bone remained. Jolene tried to protest, her voice weak between coughing fits, telling him to put her down, that she didn't need his help. Reid ignored her completely. He carried her to the door, then turned back and told Maddie to follow him. Hurry. They rushed down the stairs, through the pounding rain, and into the car. Reid laid Jolene across the back seat, Maddie sitting beside her, gripping her mother's hand without letting go. The little girl wasn't crying out loud anymore, but her eyes were drenched and full of fear as she stared at her mother without blinking. Reid drove to the best private hospital in the city, where a single night of treatment cost more than Jolene made in an entire year. When he entered the emergency room carrying Jolene in his arms, the nurses and doctors recognized him at once. The Phantom, the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles. No one asked a question. No one asked for admission paperwork or insurance. They simply moved, taking Jolene into emergency care immediately. Reid gave a curt order that he wanted the best doctor, the best VIP room, and that every expense would be paid by him, with no limit. Then he stood there in the bright hospital corridor, his clothes soaked through, watching the emergency room doors swing shut behind her. Maddie sat on a plastic chair in the waiting area, her feet not even touching the floor, her torn shoes dripping with rainwater. She stared at the emergency room door in silence, like a little statue. Reid sat down beside her. They sat there in silence for a long time, with only the sounds of medical machines and the footsteps of nurses echoing through the empty corridor. Then Maddie spoke, her voice trembling and light as breath, and asked if her mother was going to die. Reid turned to look at her. He didn't make an empty promise. He didn't offer hollow comfort. He said he didn't know, but he would do everything, absolutely everything in his power, to make her mother well again. 2 hours later, the doctor came out with the report. Severe pneumonia, already moved into a dangerous stage after being left untreated for far too long. She would need a long hospital stay, specialized medication, and professional care. Reid nodded and said, "Do it. Whatever she needs." The next morning, when Jolene woke in a spacious VIP room with fresh flowers on the table and sunlight pouring through the window, she saw Reid sitting in a chair near the bed. Maddie had fallen asleep on the sofa in the corner, the teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Jolene asked who was paying for all of this, her voice weak, but still carrying that familiar edge of stubbornness. Reid answered that it wasn't something she needed to worry about right now. Jolene tried to sit up, her brown eyes flashing with anger. She said she didn't need his pity, didn't need help from a stranger. Reid looked at her, his voice calm but firm, and asked why she hated him so much, whether they had met before, hadn't they? Jolene fell silent. Her eyes blinked quickly, as though she were trying to stop something from spilling out. Then she turned her face away and looked toward the window, saying nothing more. Reid rose from his chair and stepped out of the room, but he knew it now. She was hiding something, and the answer was very close. A week had passed since the night of the storm. Jolene had been discharged from the hospital and returned to the 4th-floor apartment, her body still weak but no longer in immediate danger. The doctor had told her she needed complete rest, that she had to take her medicine on time, and that she absolutely mustn't do any heavy work for at least 2 months. That meant no income, no rent money, no money for food. But every day, Reid appeared. He came with bags of food from the finest restaurants in the city, with expensive medicine Jolene had never been able to afford, with new school supplies for Maddie, and warm clothes for both mother and daughter. He didn't ask for anything, didn't explain anything, only set the things down on the table and then sat with Maddie or stood by the window in silence. Jolene didn't thank him. She still kept that familiar coldness, still looked at him with caution and bitterness in her eyes. But she didn't send him away anymore. Maybe because she was too tired to argue, maybe because she knew her daughter needed the things he brought. Or maybe, deep down, she was also wondering what would happen next. One night, rain fell over Los Angeles again, not as violently as the storm the week before, but still enough to turn the streets into narrow rivers. Reid came to Jolene's apartment as usual, carrying a bag of hot food and a new bottle of medicine the doctor had prescribed. He climbed the 4 familiar flights of stairs, walked through the dark hallways beneath flickering lights. When he reached the apartment door, he was about to knock, then stopped. A voice came from inside. Jolene's voice. She was talking on the phone to someone. Reid hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He had only intended to wait a moment for her to finish the call. But then he heard his name. He went still, listening. Jolene's voice drifted through the door, tired but full of feeling. She said that he kept coming every day, kept bringing food and medicine, kept sitting there playing with the little girl as if they had known each other in another life. She said that now Maddie talked about him all the time. Uncle Reid this, Uncle Reid that, as though he were some hero out of a fairy tale. Silence for a moment. The person on the other end said something Reid couldn't quite hear. Then Jolene spoke again, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. She said the strangest thing was that he didn't recognize it, that he looked at the child with eyes exactly like his own and still didn't know, that he had no idea Maddie was his biological daughter. Reid's world stopped. The bag of food slipped from his hand and fell to the hallway floor with a soft thud. Rain still fell outside, tapping on the metal roof, tapping on the windows, but he couldn't hear any of it. His ears rang. His heart slammed wildly, so hard that he could feel every beat echoing in his chest, in his temples, through his entire body. His daughter. Maddie was his daughter. 7 years. The little girl had lived 7 years in this world without him. 7 years in poverty, in want, in an oversized coat and torn shoes. 7 years selling cookies on the street to help her mother buy medicine. 7 years without knowing her father's face. Everything came crashing down at once, like the final pieces of a picture suddenly locking into place. Maddie's gray eyes exactly like his, the way she tilted her head when she thought, exactly like him, the way she had negotiated with him about the conditions for meeting her mother, sharp and unwilling to yield, exactly like him, the way she stood with her back straight and her head held high in the middle of the slums, proud and unbroken, exactly like him. He had loved her without understanding why. He had felt a fierce connection he couldn't explain. Now he knew, because she was his blood. Because his blood ran through her veins, because she was his daughter. Reid pushed the door open and stepped inside without knocking, without asking permission. Jolene was sitting on the bed with the phone pressed to her ear, and when she saw him walk in, her face went white as paper. The phone slipped from her hand and landed on the bed. Reid stood there in the middle of the small room, rain still dripping from his wet clothes onto the floor. His voice trembled when he spoke, asking why she hadn't told him, why she had hidden this from him. Jolene didn't answer. She only stared at him, her brown eyes wide with fear and defense. Reid moved closer, each step heavy as lead. He said, his voice rising now, thick with pain, that for 7 years she had hidden this from him, that he had a daughter and never knew it. Jolene surged to her feet from the bed, her body still weak but her spirit anything but. She shouted, her voice breaking under the weight of anger and sorrow buried for 7 years. She said it was because he had walked away, because he had vanished without a word of explanation, because she had woken up alone in that freezing hotel room in Las Vegas, with nothing but a silver bracelet and a shattered heart. She said she hadn't known who he was, hadn't known where he was, hadn't even known his name. She said she had faced her family alone when they cast her out, faced her friends alone when they turned their backs, faced society's judgment alone. She said she had given birth alone in a cheap public hospital, stayed awake through endless nights alone while the baby cried, worked 3 jobs alone to raise her daughter. Tears ran down Jolene's cheeks, but her voice didn't weaken. She kept going, saying that she hadn't wanted her daughter to grow up clinging to hope for a father who would come only to disappear again. that she hadn't wanted the child to be hurt the way she had been hurt, that she would rather let her daughter believe her father didn't exist than let her wait for someone who might never come. Silence. The small room sank into a heavy silence, filled only with the sound of rain outside and the ragged breathing of the two of them. Reid and Jolene looked at each other across only a few steps, but also across 7 years of distance, across 7 years of bitterness and misunderstanding, across 7 years of pain that both of them had carried in different ways. Neither of them said another word, because some wounds are too deep to be spoken aloud. Silence stretched through the small apartment, so heavy that even the steady sound of rain falling beyond the window could be heard. Reid and Jolene stood facing each other, both exhausted by the storm of emotion that had just broken loose, neither of them knowing what to say next. 7 years of resentment and misunderstanding couldn't be resolved in a matter of minutes, and both of them knew that. Then the silence was broken by the sound of soft footsteps. Small footsteps, careful, hesitant, like the sound of a mouse darting across a wooden floor. Reid and Jolene turned at the same time. From behind the worn curtain that separated the tiny sleeping area from the living room, Maddie stepped out. She was wearing an old, faded set of pajamas, her hair loose and tangled, her eyes wide open. She had heard everything. Every single word. From the moment Reid had stepped into the apartment to the moment Jolene had cried out through her tears. She had been lying behind the curtain, pretending to sleep the way children so often do when adults are talking. And she had heard the truth she had been waiting for through all 6 short years of her life. Maddie stood there, small and fragile in the middle of the damp little room, looking at Reid with eyes full of emotion. In those eyes there were questions, hope, fear, and everything a 6-year-old child should never have to carry. She spoke, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind, and asked if he was really her father, if what her mother had said was true, if she really had a father now. Reid felt something break open inside his chest. It wasn't pain. It was something else, something he had never experienced in 33 years of a life filled with darkness and violence. It was the feeling of a heart softening, melting, coming back to life. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, until his eyes were level with the little girl's. He, the most powerful Mafia boss in Los Angeles, the man who made an entire city tremble, was kneeling before a 6-year-old child in a crumbling apartment in the slums. He looked into Maddie's eyes exactly like his own, and he said in a low, steady voice that, yes, baby, it was true. He was her father. Maddie stood still. 1 second. 2 seconds. Her eyes widened even more, and her lips began to tremble. Then, like a wave breaking free, she rushed forward and threw herself into his arms with all the strength in her tiny body. She wrapped her arms around his neck as if she were afraid that if she let go, he would disappear. Reid held his daughter against him, the child he had lost for 7 years without ever knowing. The child he had loved from the first moment he saw her without understanding why. The child who carried his blood, his eyes, his stubborn spirit, his arms that had done so many cruel things, now held his daughter's small body with the utmost gentleness, as though he were holding something beyond price. He whispered into her ear, his voice rough with feeling, saying that he was sorry, so terribly sorry, that he hadn't known, that if he had known, he would have come sooner. But now he knew, and he promised her he would never leave again, never. Maddie didn't say anything. She only held on tighter, as though she wanted to disappear into the first warm embrace of the father she had waited for during all 6 years of her life. Tears rolled down her cheeks and soaked into Reid's shoulder. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a child who had finally found the thing she had longed for, ever since she realized that other children had fathers, and she didn't. Jolene stood a few steps away, witnessing the scene before her. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. 7 years. For 7 years she had hated this man. For 7 years she had fought life alone. For 7 years she had tried to bury the truth and protect her daughter from the pain of being abandoned. But as she looked at the sight before her, looked at her daughter in the arms of her biological father, all that resentment seemed to begin melting away. Not because she had forgiven him, but because she was too tired to go on being angry. And because, deep in her heart, she had wanted her daughter to have this. Reid rose to his feet, still holding Maddie in his arms. The little girl clung to his neck, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes already closed from emotional exhaustion. He turned and looked at Jolene. In a low, sincere voice, he said that he knew he had been wrong, that he knew he had missed 7 years and nothing could ever give them back, but that he wanted to make amends, that he wanted to be there from this moment on. For Maddie and for her as well, if she would allow it. Jolene looked at him for a long time and said nothing. The familiar coldness was gone from her brown eyes. All that remained was the weariness of a woman who had spent 7 years fighting alone, and something else, something very small, something that looked like hope. She didn't nod. She didn't refuse. She simply stood there, looking at the man holding her daughter in his arms, and for the first time in 7 years, she didn't feel completely alone. In the shabby little apartment on the 4th floor of the old building, beneath the soft rain of the night, the 3 of them stood together in silence. Not the heavy silence of resentment, but the silence of a beginning, of what might yet be. For the first time, they looked like a family. Reid left the 4th floor apartment late into the night. The rain had eased, leaving only scattered drops falling from the edge of the roof. He drove through the empty streets of Los Angeles, his mind spinning with 1,000 overlapping thoughts. Joy, because he had finally found his daughter, the child who carried his blood, the child he had lost for 7 years without ever knowing. But also dread for what was coming next. His life had already been complicated. Now it was becoming something far more tangled. The Beverly Hills mansion stood silent in the dark when Reid stepped inside. No lights were on upstairs, no footsteps, no murmur of a television drifting down through the stillness. Paige wasn't there. He checked the bedroom, the study, the living room, but found no sign of her. That was strange. Paige rarely went out late at night like this. The phone in Reid's pocket vibrated. A message from Paige lit up the screen. "I need to talk to you about something important. Meet me at the old restaurant." Reid stared at the message for a long moment. The old restaurant. It was where they had gone on their first date nearly 3 years earlier, when the marriage between them had still been nothing more than an idea placed on the table by their 2 families. Paige's choice of place wasn't accidental. She wanted to remind him of where they had begun, of the promises he had made. He drove to the restaurant, an elegant place in a quiet part of the city. At this hour, it should have been closed, yet the door was still unlocked, and inside only one table remained lit. Paige sat there alone, her back to the entrance, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders. When Reid stepped inside and moved around to face her, he saw her clearly. Her blue eyes were red-rimmed, dark shadows bruised the skin beneath them, and her face was pale, untouched by makeup. This wasn't the Paige he knew, the woman who was always flawless from head to toe, who never let anyone see her weakness. Reid sat down across from her. Paige didn't look directly at him. She kept her eyes on the glass of water in front of her, turning her engagement ring slowly with her fingers. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but the pain beneath it couldn't be hidden. She said she knew where he went every day, knew about the woman in the 4th floor apartment in the slum, knew about the little girl with eyes exactly like his. Reid didn't deny it. He was tired of lying, tired of hiding. He stayed silent, waiting for the fury he thought would come. But Paige didn't scream. She didn't throw anything or lash out. Instead, she lifted her head and looked him straight in the eyes, and what he saw in those blue eyes wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Pain, she said, her voice trembling, that before he said anything, before he made any decision, there was something he needed to know. She stopped, drew in a deep breath, as if gathering every last piece of courage she had. Then she said it, her voice breaking through tears, that she was pregnant, 2 months along already. Reid went still as stone. The world around him seemed to stop. Sound vanished. The light dimmed. Only Paige's words remained, echoing in his mind like a bell. Pregnant. 2 months. Paige went on, tears sliding down her cheeks, saying that she had meant to tell him long ago, from the moment she first found out. But every day he kept disappearing, kept going to see that woman and that child, kept coming home with the scent of another world clinging to his clothes. She said she hadn't known what to do, hadn't known how to hold on to a man whose heart seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Silence settled over the table. Reid looked at the woman sitting across from him, his fiancée, the woman who was meant to become his wife in a few months according to the plans of their 2 families. And now she was carrying his child, another child. Paige wiped away her tears and regained a measure of calm. Then she asked, her voice firmer now, what he intended to do. Was he going to leave her and the baby inside her for that woman and that child? Reid couldn't answer. He had no answer. On one side stood Jolene and Maddie, the past he had missed without meaning to, the daughter he had only just found again after 7 years, the woman he had wounded so deeply and now wanted to make amends to. On the other side stood Paige, the present he had committed himself to, the alliance between families he had agreed to, and now another child beginning to grow inside her. Paige stood up and slipped her coat over her shoulders. Her voice turned colder as she said she would give him time to think, because she wasn't the kind of woman who forced anyone. But there was something he needed to remember. This marriage wasn't only about feelings between two people. It was an alliance between the Ashford family and the Thornton family. It was an agreement his father had signed before he died. And if Reid broke it, the consequences wouldn't fall on him alone. She gave him one last look, her blue eyes cold as ice, and added that he had 48 hours. After that, she would speak to her father, and things would no longer be in his hands. Paige walked out of the restaurant, the sharp sound of her heels echoing through the empty space. Reid remained there alone, staring into the emptiness before him. He had thought that tonight, after finding his daughter, everything would begin to turn towards something better. He had been wrong. The real storm was only beginning. 2 days passed in mounting tension. Reid spent most of his time in the 4th-floor apartment with Jolene and Maddie, trying to make up for the years he had lost. He helped Maddie with her homework, told her stories he made up clumsily as he went along, and sat in silence beside Jolene while she took her medicine and rested. They didn't speak much, he and Jolene, but the silence between them had grown less heavy than before. The wall she had built around herself was beginning, little by little, to crack, even if she still hadn't fully opened her heart. That afternoon, Reid was sitting on the floor of the apartment with Maddie, helping her fit together the pieces of a puzzle he had bought for her. Jolene was lying on the bed resting, just as the doctor had ordered, though from time to time she glanced at the two of them with an expression too complicated for him to read. The phone in Reid's pocket vibrated. He looked at the screen and saw Nash's name. He answered, and Nash's voice came through sharp with urgency, saying that Paige was on her way to Jolene's apartment, that she had found the address and was only 10 minutes away, that he hadn't been able to stop her in time. Reid's heart tightened. He hadn't even had time to stand, hadn't had time to say a word to Jolene, when a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't a gentle, polite knock. It was hard and forceful, the knock of someone who knew she held the advantage. Reid signaled for Jolene to stay where she was, then walked to the door and opened it. Paige stood in the dark hallway, shining like a diamond in a pile of garbage. A black dress clung to her flawless body. Bright red lipstick burned against her lips, and her blonde hair had been styled into perfect waves. She looked as though she had just stepped out of an upper-class party in Beverly Hills, utterly out of place in this crumbling apartment building. But her eyes weren't out of place at all. Her blue eyes were cold as ice, sharp as blades, full of calculation and control. Paige didn't wait for Reid to invite her in. She stepped straight into the apartment, her heels striking the worn wooden floor, her gaze sweeping across every corner of the tiny room. She looked at the stained walls, the old bed, the sparse furniture, and then her eyes came to rest on Jolene, who was sitting up on the bed, and Maddie, who had moved to stand behind her mother. Paige spoke, her voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather, and said, "So this is her, the woman who has stolen the time of my future husband for weeks." Then she looked at Maddie, at the gray eyes fixed on her with fear and defense, and added, "And this is the child with eyes exactly like Reid's." Jolene rose to her feet, and the instinct of a mother made her push Maddie behind her, using her weak body as a shield for her daughter. She didn't say a word. She only looked at Paige with a stare full of wariness and challenge. Reid stepped forward, placing himself between Paige and the two of them. His voice was low and edged with warning when he said that Paige needed to calm down, and that they could talk somewhere else. Paige gave a cold little laugh, clear and lovely, but without the slightest warmth. She said he didn't need to stand there protecting them as if she were some threat, that she wasn't the kind of woman who used violence, that she was far more refined than that. Then she moved past Reid and stepped closer to Jolene, her blue eyes locking onto the brown eyes of the woman standing in front of her daughter. Paige said, her voice still even, that she only wanted Reid to remember one thing, that the child growing inside her was his as well, that no matter how much he loved this little 6-year-old girl, he also had a responsibility to the child they had not yet brought into the world. Jolene spoke then, her voice cold and steady even though her body was still weak. She said that this woman needed to leave her home immediately. Paige turned to look at Jolene, and something in her expression changed. The smooth social calm vanished. Her blue eyes became colder, sharper, more dangerous. She asked Jolene whether she knew who Reid really was, whether she knew what the Ashford family was, whether she understood what kind of world she was trying to force her way into. She went on to say that this wasn't some romantic love story from a film. This was the real world, a world where one wrong decision could get people killed, a world where a woman with nothing in her hands like Jolene had no right to demand anything at all. Heavy silence settled over the room. Maddie clutched her mother's hand, her eyes full of fear, but also full of anger. Jolene stood with her back straight, refusing to bow even while facing a powerful woman. Paige turned back to Reid, and now her voice was entirely cold, stripped of emotion. She said he had 48 hours to make a decision. Either he came back to her and honored the commitment between their families, or she would speak to her father. She added that when the Thornton family acted, it wouldn't be she who decided the fate of the people in this apartment. It would be them, and they weren't as gentle as she had been. Paige walked toward the door, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm across the wooden floor. She stopped in the doorway and turned back to look at Reid one last time. Her voice softened slightly, but it was still full of resolve. When she said that she loved him, that she had loved him from the first day they met, but that she wasn't the kind of woman who let anyone steal what belonged to her, and that he, the child in her womb, and her place in the Ashford family, all of it belonged to her. The door slammed shut behind Paige, leaving behind a suffocating silence in the tiny apartment. Reid stood there, staring at the closed door, then turned and looked at Jolene and Maddie. Jolene was holding her daughter in her arms, and her brown eyes were fixed on him with a worry she couldn't hide. Maddie pressed herself against her mother, her eyes still turned toward the door in fear. Reid knew he had dragged them into danger. He knew the Thornton family wasn't an enemy that could be taken lightly, and he knew that 48 hours wasn't enough time to find a way out. But he knew something else, too. He couldn't abandon his daughter again. Not even if he had to stand against the whole world. That night was the longest night of Reid Ashford's life. He sat alone in his study at the Beverly Hills mansion, without turning on the lights, with only the pale moonlight falling through the great wall of glass. In front of him, resting on the expensive walnut desk, was Maddie's crooked little drawing. Two people standing side by side, hand in hand, with the clumsy words written beneath them. Uncle Reid and Maddie. He looked at the drawing in the dark, and for the first time in many years, he truly looked back at his own life. 33 years. He had spent most of that time building an empire built on blood, on fear, on shadowy deals and wars for power fought in the dark. He had believed that was all he needed. Money, power, respect, or rather, the terror of everyone around him. But tonight, sitting alone in that vast and freezing mansion, he realized that power didn't give him peace. Money didn't give him a sense of belonging. The fear of others didn't fill the emptiness inside his chest. He thought about Maddie, the gray eyes exactly like his, looking at him with complete trust when she had thrown herself into his arms, her rare smile when he had taught her arithmetic on a dusty sidewalk, the crooked drawing she had made for him with all her heart, the innocent question that had cut so deep. "Are you going to disappear, Dad?" He thought about Jolene, the woman who had fought alone for 7 years, never bowing to poverty, never collapsing under sickness, never surrendering to fate. The woman who looked at him with eyes full of bitterness and yet full of pride, refusing his help because she didn't want to owe anyone anything. The woman he had abandoned without meaning to 7 years ago, leaving her to face everything alone. He thought about Paige, and he realized, with a clarity so painful it almost felt like a wound, that he had never loved her. Through nearly 3 years together, he had never once felt his heart move for her. Their coming marriage was an arrangement, a strategic alliance between two powerful families. He had agreed to it because it was good for the empire, because his father had arranged it before he died, because he hadn't believed love was something he needed or deserved. And the child Paige was carrying, he would take responsibility. That child was innocent, blameless in the choices made by adults. He would be that child's father, would provide for that child fully, would be present in that child's life. But responsibility toward a child didn't mean he had to spend his entire life with a woman he didn't love. Reid stood up. The decision had been made. He took out his phone and called Nash. In a voice calm but impossible to move, he ordered Nash to assign men to protect Jolene and Maddie 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and not let anyone near them. He said to prepare for a confrontation with the Thornton family, because he knew they wouldn't stay quiet once he broke off the engagement, and he said to prepare everything necessary for him to formally sever the alliance. Nash was silent for a moment. Then he asked, his voice grave, whether Reid was certain, because this wasn't some small fight. This was war, full-scale war, with one of the most powerful families in the city. Reid looked out the window, looked at Los Angeles glittering in the night, the city he had spent half his life conquering, and he answered, his voice steady, that he knew, but there were things worth fighting for, and his daughter was one of them. The next morning, Reid went to the 4th-floor apartment before the sun had climbed too high. Jolene opened the door, her eyes still heavy with sleep, surprise flickering across her face when she saw him there so early. Maddie was still asleep in the tiny space behind the old curtain. Reid stepped inside the apartment and stood in front of Jolene. He looked straight into her brown eyes, without looking away, without hesitation. He said he had made his decision, that he was choosing her and Maddie. Jolene stared at him, her eyes widening with shock and disbelief. She asked, what about the other woman? What about the child she was carrying? Reid answered that he would take responsibility for that child, that the baby had done nothing wrong and he would be a father to that child in every true sense. But he didn't love Paige, had never loved her, and he couldn't spend his life with someone for whom he felt nothing. Then he did something he had never done for anyone in his life. He went down on one knee. One knee touched the worn wooden floor of the shabby apartment as he faced the woman he had abandoned without meaning to, 7 years before. From inside his coat, he took out a small box. Inside it wasn't a glittering diamond ring like the one he had once intended to give Paige. It was a simple silver ring, with a finely engraved wolf on its surface, exactly like the silver bracelet he had given Jolene 7 years earlier in Las Vegas. He spoke in a low, sincere voice, and said that he knew storms were coming, knew danger and war were coming, knew he was pulling her into a world full of darkness, but he wanted to face all of it with her. He wanted to make up for the 7 lost years. He wanted to be Maddie's father, and wanted to be by Jolene's side. He asked if she would give him a chance. Jolene looked at him, at the man kneeling before her, the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles holding a simple silver ring in his hand. Tears rolled down her cheeks. 7 years of bitterness, 7 years of fighting alone, 7 years of raising a child through poverty and sickness. All of it seemed to soften in this single moment. She didn't say a word. She only nodded. A small nod, but it was all Reid needed. From behind the curtain, Maddie came running out, her eyes shining bright. She had woken up at some point and had heard everything. She threw herself at both of them, her tiny arms trying to wrap around both her father and her mother at once. Reid held his daughter and the woman he had chosen there in that shabby little apartment on the 4th floor of the old building, and for the first time in 33 years of life, he felt that he belonged somewhere. A week had passed since the day Reid knelt and asked Jolene to marry him in that shabby apartment on the 4th floor. Many things had changed. He had moved Jolene and Maddie into a new penthouse in a safer part of the city, one he had prepared in advance with strict security systems and guards on watch, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The penthouse wasn't as lavish as the Beverly Hills mansion. It didn't have expensive paintings or furniture imported from Europe, but it was spacious enough for Maddie to have a room of her own, with a soft bed and a new desk for school. It was warm enough that Jolene no longer had to worry about electric bills or rent. It was safe enough for both mother and daughter to sleep soundly without fearing anything. That afternoon, warm golden sunlight poured through the wide windows of the penthouse and lit the entire living room. Maddie was sitting at the dining table, colored pencils in her hand, concentrating on a new drawing. Now she had a full set of colors, and no longer had to rely on the short, faded pencil stubs she had used before. Jolene sat on the sofa near the window, holding a book she had wanted to read for a long time, but had never had the time or money to buy. Her health had improved greatly after proper treatment and real rest. A little color had returned to her cheeks, and her brown eyes no longer carried that look of bone-deep exhaustion they once had. Reid sat at the work desk in the corner of the room, reviewing the files Nash had sent over. He still had to run his empire, still had to deal with the problems of the underworld. But now, every time he lifted his head and saw his daughter drawing, saw Jolene reading in the light of the late afternoon sun, he felt something he had never known before. Peace. An ordinary family. The very thing Reid Ashford, the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles, had never believed he would ever have. Maddie suddenly jumped to her feet and ran to Reid with the picture she had just finished in her hands. She proudly told her father, her voice bubbling with excitement, that she was done and that this was the most beautiful picture she had ever drawn. Reid took the drawing and looked at what his daughter had made. 3 people stood side by side, hand in hand, beneath a brilliant yellow sun. Above them, in crooked but readable letters, were the words, "Maddie's family." He gathered his daughter into his arms, and he smiled. A real smile, one that rose from the deepest place in his heart, the kind of smile he had thought he had forgotten how to make. Jolene watched the 2 of them from the sofa, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt peace. No more fear about rent money or medicine. No more loneliness in raising a child by herself. No more resentment toward the man who had walked away 7 years earlier. Only the peace of the present and hope for the future. Then Reid's phone vibrated, breaking the quiet moment apart. He looked at the screen. An unknown number. A short message. "Did you really think you could leave me that easily? The war has only just begun." P. Reid looked at the message, and his face turned cold. He lifted his head and looked out through the wide windows of the penthouse, and he saw it. A black car parked across the street, directly below their building. It didn't take a genius to understand what that car was doing there. Watching, following, waiting. Paige wasn't giving up. The Thornton family was making its move. Reid deleted the message and set the phone down on the table. He didn't let Jolene or Maddie see the worry on his face. He only turned back and looked at the 2 most important people in his life. Jolene was watching him with questioning eyes, as if she could already sense that something was wrong. Maddie was still hugging her picture, her eyes bright and shining because her father had praised her. Reid knew the storm was coming. He knew the Thornton family wouldn't back down easily. He knew there would be war, bloodshed, danger. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time, he had something to protect, and he was ready to fight with his last breath. He walked over to Jolene, sat beside her, and took her hand in his. She looked at him and said nothing, but she squeezed his hand tightly, like a silent promise that she would stand beside him. Maddie ran over and climbed onto the sofa between them, wrapping her arms around both her father and her mother. Outside the window, the sky over Los Angeles was beginning to change. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance, swallowing part of the afternoon light, but farther beyond them, a streak of gold still broke through, falling over the city like a reminder. Like Reid's life, darkness and light, always side by side. He had lived in darkness for far too long. Now he had found his light, and he would fight to keep it, even if he had to stand against the whole world. Power can buy almost everything, but it can't buy back lost time. And sometimes, redemption comes from the hands of those who seem to have nothing at all. The story ends here, but Reid's war is only beginning. Thank you for following this story from beginning to end. If you found it meaningful and moving, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video to support us, so we can continue bringing you compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did Reid make the right choice? Should Jolene forgive him? And how do you think the war with the Thornton family will unfold? We'd truly love to hear what your heart has to say. So please leave a comment below and let's talk about it together. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.